Hi there. Well, thanks ever so much for taking time out to spend some time with us today. This is the fourth of our expert panels for Change Creation and People Make It Work. Change Creation is a change-orientated 2-year leadership program for the cultural sector, and we've got 60 people on that program from 40 different organisations. And People Make It Work helps cultural organisations to change and develop. And it's 20 years old this year. With me today, we've got Jeanie, Vanessa and Charles, who will kind of do a little introduction as they start speaking. And this is the fourth of our weekly live expert panels. They're all live experts. And the purpose of these is to reflect on the current COVID-19 crisis and the ways in which cultural organisations and charities can respond and reflect on these times. So I'm going to ask Jeanie, first of all, to share a few comments for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll move to Charles and then to Vanessa. And then after that, we'll have a bit more of a sort of in-depth conversation with each of those 3 people in turn. So first of all, Jeanie.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Jeanie and I run a consultancy called Culture Radar, and I've been associated with People Make It Work for a few years. I've been doing that for a couple of years. Before that, I've done a number of different things. I worked in as a sponsorship advisor and consultant with businesses and arts organisations for many years. I was a publisher, so I've worked in the creative industry sector for quite some time. I suppose most recently was, before I became a consultant, was running an arts membership organisation, a company called AN, which is an organisation that I'll maybe come back to and draw on a little bit for what I'm going to talk about this morning. In terms of sort of thoughts and reflections on what's been happening, well, what's been happening, everything has been happening. I suppose very conscious that there's a huge amount of valuable advice and sort of comment that has already taken place both within People Make It Work and the Change Creation Network, and through my kind of peer networks and things. And that can actually be quite a bombardment of information, and it can be quite a lot to try and process and make sense of, which is, I think, what everybody is doing at the moment, is trying to make sense of things. And I think actually at the weekend, one of the things that I felt to be quite reassuring was just recognising that this is a globally forced change, that this isn't something that I've chosen or I've instigated. This is something that's happening to everyone, that's being put upon everyone. And in some ways felt that that actually has taken the stress out of what's going on to a certain extent for me as well. And I think probably for a lot of people in our sector as well, taking that as a positive and thinking, well, actually, yes, this is something that we're all having to deal with, we're all getting to grips with at the moment, and we all don't have to be experts in managing this level of critical change overnight. We don't actually have to have it all right within 2 weeks. And I think the other thing that I've been noticing a lot is this kind of tension, which goes on all day between a sense of urgency and a sense of needing to reflect on things. And actually those two things, trying to get those to work together, can be quite difficult. So I thought I would kind of maybe try and sort of say a little bit about that as well. In terms of the change and the level of change, one of the key things that I suppose is affecting everybody in isolation who are also trying to continue working is getting used overnight to remote working. And I think in some respects, the arts sector, the cultural sector, probably is naturally quite agile, or has been. There are a lot of organisations that have adapted to that over the last few years. For a lot of organisations, though, it's going to be very new and quite a different thing to get to grips with. So I thought I would maybe just spend a little bit of time talking about how things worked in the last company that I worked in, which was based on remote working, agile working, and to see if I could draw out some of the kind of pros and cons of that from a kind of, I suppose, my kind of professional or personal experience of having managed that situation, and see if there was anything useful in that for people. So, do you want me just to carry on and chat a little bit about that?
Take us into a bit of depth around some of those. That'd be great.
Okay. So in terms of AN, I can manage that organisation for about 4 or 5 years. It's an arts membership organisation. It is a company, so we had some public funding, but actually the majority of our income came from earned income from our membership. About 23,000 members across the UK, and I had about a team of about 18. So that was a mixture of part-time and full-time employees, regular freelancers and irregular freelancers, in the sense that there were people that I worked with off and on at different times. The whole company, I would say that probably about 80–85% of our business and our work day to day was all done virtually online. And that was utilising a company intranet, it was using Skype, audio and video, but also Skype chat a lot as a way of making contact and keeping contact, as well as all the usual things like, you know, kind of phone calls and text messaging and emails and things. And we also tried to kind of dovetail that kind of working with fairly regular meetups. So, you know, maybe every 6 weeks getting the whole company together in person. But the majority of our time was spent individually working from our homes in different ways. So there are a huge number of pros, I think, in remote working and how that can help organizations. And actually, just as from a, I mean, that company chose to work that way. It actually made that transition to being digitally enabled a good 10 to 15 years ago. So it was already working that way before I took over. And it was a sensible way of approaching a really lean, agile business model. But it was also a way of marrying, I suppose, employment with the gig economy, which I think was a really interesting way of working. So our membership were artists who tend to work more than one job at any one time. And actually, by using remote working, it meant that I could work with and employ artists, sometimes just for a couple of hours a week, but sometimes, you know, 2 or 3 times a week, but for short spaces of time, they could drop in and out around their practice, they could drop in and out around their work. But it also meant that my workforce absolutely reflected who our members were. So there was absolutely kind of win-win both ways from that point of view. The technical side of it, technology is absolutely an enabler. There is really not very much that you can't do in a kind of digitally enabled company. But technology is more often or not the sort of easy bit of it. And I think one of the things that I thought it'd be useful to talk about is, well, some of the useful things about adopting that agile side and how that can be helpful in managing teams and getting work done, but also some of the, I suppose, cons in how you manage a team remotely. So we tended to work to what is known as an agile approach, and agile obviously is an approach that is used more often in kind of software or technology sector. So we use that, but with some adaptations. And it relies on agile teams that are pulled together from across an organization to deliver projects to priorities that are aligned to what the business or the organization is there to deliver. So you're working all the time towards your vision or your mission, and you're prioritizing the projects that you're pulling teams together to deliver to meet that. One of the good things about working with agile teams is that it's quite non-hierarchical, which can be quite scary or difficult for organizations that have a very traditional structure. But actually I think this situation is one way that organizations could maybe be trying to pilot or test some of that working. it's also a really good way of empowering teams or empowering staff members and helping people to feel that they have control and responsibility in quite a safe way as well. So pulling together and making teams, drawing teams based on the expertise that is needed to deliver a project is quite useful. So that also takes people away from working just within the marketing department or just within the tech department or whatever, but getting cross-functional teams going to solve problems can be quite useful. And also encouraging them to collectively set targets and outcomes for those projects. Quite often in normal structures, it's a case of a boss or a team leader or a head of a department saying, right, this is what we have to do, you're doing this, this, and this. This approach is very much of, well, this is the problem, or this is the thing that we want to make happen. How collectively can we agree how to make that happen or how to realize it? And to also kind of set targets within that team or responsibilities, so being really clear about who is doing what and what is going to be achieved altogether. And being really clear within that team as well about who is going to be responsible for decision making on a day-to-day basis, which rather than it always filtering back up a line to one person and getting stuck, then actually empowering teams to agree or to have decision making up to a certain level is quite a useful thing. And I think at the moment, that kind of approach is maybe quite useful for people who are already finding themselves having to work in a different way, who are also getting used to spending a lot of time on their own or working, on their own at home. Yeah. Is bringing them together in teams across an organization, so working with people maybe that they haven't worked with before within the organization, and maybe also helping people to chunk down what feels like an enormous problem at the moment. So being able to look at some of the priorities within an organization, breaking those down into a series of tasks, and then within Agile, quite often what you'll do is pull together teams to work in short sprints and things. So the first step of that task is to make this thing happen. And if you have 4 or 5 people brought together just to deal with that sprint, look back and reflect, you can build quite a useful iterative learning process into that, and you can make incremental decisions along the way. But the important thing is that you are always moving forward. You're not necessarily starting out with the whole of the elephant and just chunking and biting your way through it, you know. And I think that incremental decision making and learning process is actually quite a useful thing for teams to start learning and thinking in a different way. And I think whatever comes at the end of this, I think we're all going to have to be much more naturally learning organizations. So actually embedding that and building that in very small steps or small ways within your teams are quite a good thing. Right. I think one of the other benefits of Agile and using teams remotely, working remotely in that way, is that you can test things, you can pilot things. And I think particularly at the moment, when there is so much noise and so much stuff going on in the world, that this could be a time where there is a project that somebody might have thought was a good idea, but it's been too difficult to try or have a go at delivering in another way. Maybe you pilot it at the moment, you test it, it's low risk, because if it goes wrong, nobody's going to know. It can be hidden, I think. But no matter what, you've gone through the process of trying that out as a team, and you can learn from what worked and what didn't work that you can then apply to the next pilot. So I think there are, a lot of good reasons for adopting remote working and maybe trying to keep it going and using it as a way of changing the culture in your organization or how your teams work together.
Jeanie,
on the reverse side of that.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I think that's really wonderful. And maybe we'll come back to hear some more from you in a little while, and perhaps we could talk some more about, some of the risks and placemaking and partnership stuff. But it sounded like you were going to say something more about Agile. So let's start with that on our next round.
Okay, that's grand.
As we come back to you. Thank you so much. So at this stage, I would love to hear from you, Charles.
Yes.
Could you start by just kind of giving us a sense of, kind of what you're up to and what you've been doing?
Yeah.
And then, what would you like to draw our attention to at this time as we're sort of reflecting on our circumstances?
Sure. So, hello everybody, I'm Charles. I worked for a long time at Arts Council England, primarily in the literature department, but also as a senior officer for digital and creative media there, where I helped arts organisations to develop their online presence and put more of their content online. After that, I worked for a year for the European Cultural Foundation, which is a private funding foundation based in Amsterdam that works all across Europe with cultural organisations. And over the last few years, I've been working as a freelance consultant. I've worked with the Change Creation Programme, the first iteration of the Change Creation Programme with Richard, and People Make It Work. And I've also done a lot of independent projects with organisations based in the UK, in Holland, and now in Spain as well. And I'm really delighted to be taking part in this conversation today. I think we're all finding this situation extremely challenging and uneasy. And I think one of the things that I really want to talk about today is this idea of uncertainty and the sort of feeling of that can be slightly bewildering at the scale of these changes which have come across literally in the last couple of months. When I started this year, I was doing work with an organization on their new business plan involving a risk assessment. And they do a lot of international work. So we were looking at all kinds of factors to do with Brexit, to do with the changes that would bring. Nowhere on our horizon scanning was there anything that said coronavirus 19. I mean, it literally wasn't in the planning until a couple of months ago. And all of a sudden, it's put us all in this position where, we are having to rearrange, rethink, readapt, cancel events, furlough staff, and we're all trapped at home. So it's quite an extraordinary situation. And I'm very interested in how, as staff and as our leaders and teams in organizations, we think about uncertainty, how we deal with it, how we manage it, how we become a bit more comfortable living in a situation with uncertainty, and also how we try to reduce some of the pressures that we feel or that we put on ourselves because we don't feel perhaps that we're responding in the right way, or we don't feel we're able to do as much as we ought to be doing. So I think, just to reiterate the point that Jeanie was making at the beginning, we have to remember that this is a global crisis which has sprung almost out of nowhere and just stopped virtual economic activity in a matter of weeks. So it's no wonder that we're all feeling slightly in shock and unsure, about how to proceed. But there are techniques for thinking about uncertain situations, how we prioritize certain things, how we focus on particular aspects of our work, whether that's returning to the very core of our mission and our values and rethinking about what we absolutely have to do to keep those going, to keep those delivering, whether it's simply acknowledging that the situation is uncertain, that some factors are beyond our immediate control, and so not feeling under pressure to influence or achieve things which we simply aren't able to achieve in a situation like this. Some of that thinking comes from psychology and thinking about questions of uncertainty and anxiety, how we react as people to those factors. And we have to, embody that and reflect that in our work and who we are and how we think about leading organizations or developing our plans. So I want to talk a little bit about coping with uncertainty or thinking about uncertainty, especially in a situation where we don't really know yet how long this is going to last. Are we going to see a very sort of quick rebound to life as normal? Or is it going to take a lot longer to come back to where we were before? And if that's the case, how are we going to try to position ourselves over these next few months to try to come out as strong or even stronger than we did before? So that's one thing I really want to focus on. I want to talk a little bit about communications and audience engagement during this period, and how do we make sure that we're really still in contact with or having a close relationship with our partners, our stakeholders, and our audiences, and making sure that they at least are aware of some of our thinking, of some of the experiences that we're having as we go through this, so that we don't kind of lose that touch or lose that feeling of the organization's importance in its community and for its audiences. We talked a little bit, Jeanie's talked very interestingly about digital technology, and it's been interesting for someone like me who did a lot of work trying to encourage people to put more work online to see over the last few weeks how this crisis has really brought about a kind of shift in the amount of remote events, exhibitions, and work that's being shared through all kinds of different formats. So in some ways, that's a very positive development for me personally, to kind of see how that change is happening. But I think our organizations also need to think not just about this period of time, but digitally, what's realistic, what is actually helpful for us to be trying to achieve digitally over this period. Again, we don't want to be putting so much pressure on ourselves, hearing that everybody's doing wonderful free concerts or beaming things out all over the world. If that's not something that's within our remit or our capabilities, I don't think we need to feel that's necessarily the way to go. But on the other hand, there are opportunities perhaps to pilot or prototype things. Jeanie's talked again about the agile approach, which comes from the world of software prototyping and development. And so there may be, and I'm already seeing artists and organizations trying little bite-sized pieces here and there via social media or online. So there are opportunities. And yeah, I finally, again, it's all related, but I also quite like to talk about a concept which comes from the thinker Nassim Nicholas Taleb, which is this idea of anti-fragility, which is an idea that sometimes the pressure that unexpected crises or events put on us can actually help us to generate the type of resilience which goes beyond just being able to withstand those shocks, but actually puts us in a stronger position in the future as well. So it's a sort of radical way of thinking about the challenges of a crisis like this and uncertainty. But I think some of that thinking can be useful and can help us to think positively about how we might respond to the current situation. So those are some of the things that I'd like to go into in a bit more detail in a minute.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Would you like to develop one of those strands for us at this stage, and then we'll come back and hear from you about some of the others in a while. But which is there something that you'd like to kind of just develop a little bit more, Charles?
Yeah, so I mean, I think just taking the first point about uncertainty and how that affects us, I think there are a lot of different, techniques that we can sort of learn or develop to help us to cope with some of those things. I mean, first of all, I think that, thinking correctly about the perspective of the situation that we're in is very important. So not just sort of benchmarking ourselves against our peers or against our own expectations, but thinking realistically about what this situation means for the whole world and the whole economy and our place within it, so that we don't feel quite so bewildered by the scale of events, thinking that we don't have to be the ones to kind of solve everything in this situation, because it's not personal to us, it's affecting, and obviously it's also taking a toll, in human terms, in lives lost. So some of the things which, may seem sort of life or death to us on a day-to-day basis in our professional lives, something that can help us perhaps to put those in perspective is the actual, impact that this is having in other areas. I think, and also another way that I've always found very helpful to think about uncertainty and the sort of anxiety that comes with uncertainty is to think about what remains within my ability to control or to change. And those things that, I have a limited ability to control or change, I can think in a very systematic way about the steps I might take to give myself more ability to change them. But I don't have to worry about being responsible for, completely changing that situation myself. I can only really continue to take full responsibility for the things which remain within my power to change. And, I think that way of thinking can be very helpful in terms of just reducing your sense of being overwhelmed by uncertainty and change. Obviously, we've talked a bit earlier about really going back to the kind of key principles and re-examining what is it that drives me as an artist or drives my organization. What is it we are really here to achieve? Breaking that down, as we do when we try to think about sort of longer term strategic initiatives for an organization, and then adapting what that might mean to this current situation. But I think all of these are different ways of critical thinking about uncertainty and the situation that we find ourselves in, that hopefully can help to ease our sense of being completely at sea or unsure of what to do, and feeling very pressurized or very sort of stressed by that. Because I think quite often, you know, when you go through a sort of shock as this has been on such a scale, it leaves you with a feeling of not just of uncertainty, but you know, anxiety about the fact that you haven't been producing something or doing something or finding the solution. And I think we have to acknowledge, because of how widespread and how major this crisis is, that we are going to, you know, feel unsure of ourselves for a while. And we have to be able to sort of relieve some of that sense of responsibility. So I think adapting some of those kind of techniques of critically thinking through what am I actually able to do? What can I take responsibility for? What is my key mission and how can it adapt to this situation? And what perspective should I have on my role in this, you know, whole situation, can really help to sort of relieve some of that anxiety, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Well, we'll be back for some more of that in a while. But first of all, Vanessa, would you like to tell us what you've been noticing and what you'd like to sort of explore in this panel today?
Thanks, Richard, and hello everybody, and thank you for taking the time to come and listen to us today. Just a few words about my background and how it relates to what I'm going to talk about. I've been an associate, consultant associate with People Make It Work for around 3 years now. I'm currently, amongst other things, a consultant grant assessor to a funding organisation. So I will want to talk about insights, things that I'm hearing from the grantee or applicant grantee end. But my background, and the reason I'm doing this kind of work, is that my background is working for organisations that, generally speaking, at the start anyway, were not in receipt of public funding. So there was always a need to develop strategies for financial sustainability, and that invariably involved developing earned income, aligning that with fundraising, aligning it to the whole organization's strategy. So I've been a chief exec of Cockpit Arts and turned that around with a very difficult start, no, you know, cash flow problems and so on. So I like looking at the organization in the round, working alongside people. So with this particular funder, which is exemplary, there was face-to-face, there is now phone-to-phone contact. So essentially I receive applications. There are 1 or 2 emergency funds that I think are doing this. And I think that talking about uncertainty, the funders are uncertain too. And I think that puts applicants in a really strong position at the moment. But there are 3 areas I want to talk about, things that are coming through the applications. First of all is probably because it's called an emergency fund, many are applying for funds to deal with immediate needs. And I noticed, and that came across in the paper application, but having looked around on their website and looked at various accounts and so on, I was in a position where I could ask questions because they were being fairly silent about their thinking on how funds applied for could be used for longer term organizational effectiveness. In many cases, getting a double whammy benefit, not exclusively so, because there may have been, there could be a very right and proper reason why the money is to deal with, something immediate that is an emergency. There was, when I probed some of the applicants, there was a sense that the leaders definitely had ideas. That's not to say other people didn't too, but the leader, I think, had, in those instances, had talked to other team members, and those team members were doubtful that it could work because, and let's face it, they generally, whole teams have been getting used to not being able to do business as usual. So the notion, the mental shift that's required in, oh, and we could do this, but we've never done it before, takes a little time to come to terms with. So what was clear to me was the benefit of having somebody else outside the organization, if not inside the organization, because I have to say that here is where the boards of directors, the boards of trustees really need to step up if not already doing so, but it's not always possible. I have come across chairs of trustees of organizations applying for funds, and they've got they've been affected by the virus and have had to step back and so on. So the benefit, I think, in talking to somebody else, whether it is another organization or a consultant, is not to be underestimated, because those ideas may be intended to be short term and haven't been tried and tested. But in the end, they might be valuable additions to services and programs. And at any rate, talking about something where you're getting doubt from other team members just can give confidence about not being dissuaded that it might not work. Then secondly, under the general banner of repivoting strategies, or what I like to call how to develop something that you always wanted to happen but never thought you could. I think this is the time when there's a real opportunity here for your organizations to present your social, cultural values in a way that you will have done before, but actually it's very evident now that you can really go to town on it and be heard. The funders, there have always been one or two funders that have been very open to organizational development, but they have been few and far between. And now, if you think about all the funding criteria that various charitable trusts and foundations have had over the years, they've got to unlock that box, because many of those things don't apply anymore. So I think that's my starting point. Think about how you got the power. But I want to, in all of that, I want to just quickly say, I've noticed stuff around emergency appeals. And there are some that are good, and there are some that are not so good. And the ones that are good are the ones that are talking not about the finances, but humanity. And the ones that are not very good are, even if they don't really mean it, are over concentrating on, we need a gap to fill, and forgetting about what they do, why they do it, and what they're doing differently as a result of the virus. So don't miss a trick there. Be speedy, but really think it through. I've seen organizations that have decided to have their courage of their convictions about direction of travel that they may have put in front of funders before and had rejected. And have thought, well, you know what, well, yeah, it was a nice idea, but it's just not wanted. I've seen organizations being approached by a funder and said, you know what, we actually need to be doing the right stuff right now in this particular context, and could we resurrect what we were talking about and dismissed and get it going? So in that, I think there's something here about, is there anything in your organization that you really thought was the right thing to do, whenever it was fairly recently or in the past, but is contextually the right thing to do now? Pick up the phone to a funder that is relevant to you or that you know very well, and give it a go. Because coming back to that point about the funders, you know, they've had to unlock the box, and the particular policies that you had to apply under before are no longer straitjacketed, I would say. I've seen greater collaboration, especially with those arts organisations which had already developed good partner networks, where, and you're probably doing some of this, it's an obvious one, is playing on the strengths of particular partners, whether you discover that they have particularly good, you know, IT systems or databases or data collection mechanisms, then, you know, actually think, could this be strength in numbers, and could we get stuff done that is important to our beneficiaries, because we're actually all dealing with the same, you know, the same group. And then I'm also getting organisations that are concerned about the fact that, yes, at the moment things need to be digital, more use of digital for beneficiaries and customers, and they recognise that actually there might be a realisation that they're going to continue with a lot of that, because it's cost saving, it's a good use of resources, and it has an effect. You know, they'll keep it where it has impact and a positive effect. But they're also concerned, if we do that, have we actually also lost something? And what, and you know, that's not to say that there wouldn't be physical face-to-face at that point in time, activities at that time, but it's, have we also lost something even if we saved a bit of money, and what added value might we need to build back into the organisation, and I don't, or into the delivery or programs, and they don't know what that looks like. But I think they're very mindful that it would be very easy to say, oh great, we can save a bit of money here and still get impact, but not actually recognise that there could be an added value element that could make it even better. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we might hear a little bit more from you later on, but now I'm going to come back to Jeanie, if that's all right, Jeanie. You were talking about agile methodologies, and you were talking about what you've learned when you were working at AN. And I think I interrupted you, and you had one final thing to say on that. And then I wondered if we could also talk a bit about, I don't know whether it's possible to talk about the opportunities that come from such a movement as this. Maybe you've got something to share in that area.
Yeah, no, I think it was probably quite appropriate timing that you cut in when you did, actually, because Charles did a really useful kind of discussion about uncertainty, and I think you've also picked up, Vanessa, on some of these quandaries, I suppose, that arts organisations are having about, you know, well, what do we do with digital, or how do we engage with it? I think on the reason I kind of wanted to talk and say a little bit about agile is that I think that is an opportunity for people to try things out. But I am mindful that actually alongside that is that it could be a massive learning curve for a lot of people, but both staff, but also managers or leaders of organisations to get to grips with. And I think some of these kind of things to be mindful for, maybe kind of tip in or kind of reflect back on some of the points that you made, Charles. So I think there are probably just kind of 2 or 3 things on that before maybe get on to some of the other opportunities. And one of those is this kind of way of remote working, as brilliant as it is, what you do miss out on, particularly as a manager, or if you're running an organization, is all of the very, very important non-verbal and informal communication that happens within organizations that you take for granted when you share an office space. And there are asides, there's chats, there's informal conversation going on. As a manager, you're able to read body language in your staff, in your teams. You're able to kind of assess or kind of sense what mood teams are in, where their energy levels are, whether somebody's struggling or not. And I think in a remote kind of working situation, it is, I think particularly when there is this sense of urgency going on, it's actually very difficult to keep on top of that. And I think one of the rules, I suppose, of, you know, sort of if you're running an organization at the moment is, yes, you have to keep the business going, or you want to keep the organization going, you want to deliver the mission, but you absolutely have to, you have a duty of care for these people that you work with, whether they're employed by you or whether they work for you freelance or they're in your network. So it's, you know, how do you will have these skills, but you may at this point need to amplify certain skills, and kind of, because you can't rely on, you know, just having that face-to-face contact all the time. So it's, you know, how can you build things into how you work remotely that is going to help you read what is happening within your team and how to look after them. So one, I think, is definitely that feedback becomes critical in terms of how you are encouraging the staff or feeding back, or your teams, when, you know, things are going well, or when they've, you know, they're trying something new, or how things are, you know, just responding generally to how people are managing with the situation. But it's absolutely critical that that feedback is two ways, and that might be something, depending on the culture of an organization, that might be quite new, it might not be, it can be difficult, but finding a way of being able to develop a culture of supported or positive sort of feedback that is two ways, so that your team are encouraged to let you know when they are feeling uncomfortable about something, or where they feel that they're not managing or coping with new ways of working. So it's an opportunity, I think, to kind of, I suppose, build relationships within your team as well. The other thing is about that communication loop has to be constant. And where a lot of knowledge within an organization is informal, it can get dropped out if you're having one-to-one Zooms or Skypes with people. There might be a group chat on Skype or group calls, but there might be little aside conversations that are getting missed. So how do you kind of build that in? Is it that you have one company Skype chat, which everybody drops all that kind of informal stuff into, and people keep in with it? And maybe limiting the number of channels that you're using. There is a tendency to try everything, have Skype, you know, all sorts of different kind of rooms or things going, but actually you can just sort of dilute the communication at that point. So maybe at this point, trying to focus in on 2 or 3 channels is quite a good one. Second thing is that you, I think if you're running teams or looking after teams, is you establish a certain level of trust within you, from your point of view as a manager or a leader of an organization, and how people work. And depending on the size of the team that you have, or who you've employed at different times, who you've inherited, sometimes some people feel that turning up and being in their seat 9 to 5 is them contributing. And you can keep an eye on that and kind of work with that as a manager or leader. If you're turning on your machine and dropping a message into chat, but then otherwise not being very visible, it can be very difficult from a managing point of view to know really how those kind of, how everybody is contributing or not, or coping or not with the change. So I think that kind of finding ways of, you know, helping your teams to work together and keep an eye on each other and build up a kind of peer support, and, you know, helpfully kind of feedback or encourage people to make sure that they're carrying, you know, their part of a project is quite a useful thing. And the last thing I wanted to say on this was, even if you've been running a very busy organization and you've had, you know, usual days of back-to-back meetings, phone calls, out and about or whatever, there is something about being sat at a laptop all day on back-to-back Zoom meetings or Skype meetings and keeping people in communication, which is exhausting in a way that you might not have experienced before. So I think trying to kind of take that on board and understand that if this is a new way of working for you, that this kind of tiredness is something that actually you need to manage and you need to look after yourself with. And you need to just kind of manage your time slightly differently. So make sure that you are getting time away from the screen. Try and have a workspace that is separate maybe from where your life is in your home. And even if you don't have a separate room to do that in, having a space that you work at but that you close up at the end of your day. I even had one colleague who used to work at their kitchen table, and at the end of the day they shut their laptop down and would shout in a very loud way to the rest of their family members, "I'm home." Because mentally for them that meant they had left work. They'd been used to, you know, having a whole commute and getting home, and I think they were finding it really difficult to separate work and life. And I think particularly at the moment where we are in our homes with our families, if you are working and trying to do that, finding ways to kind of separate those kind of parts of your life is going to be really important for you, but it's also really important for your family to know when you are available and free as well. So
right, I love that.
And in terms of kind of opportunities, I think just kind of picking up on what Charles had said about being really clear about using this time to reflect on core purpose is really important when there's so much going on. And I think now more than any, this is an opportunity to kind of lose some frills, think about what is really needed and what your organization is really good at, what people really want or need from you at the moment or in the future. We are going to be going into a time where there will be less money, less time. People will need culture more than ever, but they may have more difficulty accessing it. So what are the key things that your organization can do to really help with them and for you to flourish and deliver your mission?
Thank you. I really loved hearing all of that, and it feels so important to have some voices that have been living the experience of working virtually, because some of the things that you've learned are you know, really specific, and like some of that stuff around feedback and around how to judge presence is you know, definitely kind of your lived experience, isn't it? And it seems ever so important right now, for sure. Mm-hmm. Charles, where do you want to take our conversation next?
Well, I mean, I wanted to pick up actually on just a segue into a bit more about this topic of remote working and presence. And I think Jeanie said some really, really interesting things about, you know, managing teams, but also just the sense of being separated from people when you're remote working. I mean, for the last few years, most of my work has been conducted virtually, either by Skype or Zoom or email and telephone or WhatsApp. And even though, you know, you are able to communicate effectively your ideas or your suggestions with people, for me as a consultant working with arts organizations, I very often feel that if I don't meet them in person, or if I'm not physically in a room with a board of directors or with a chief executive or someone, I feel very much like an outsider. You know, there's a sort of digital barrier that we have created these tools which allow us to give a sort of approximation of presence and intimacy, but it's not the same. And I think that is something that you really do have to take into account. And quite often I can come away from a conversation feeling that I've had via Skype or Zoom, feeling as if I don't know if my advice or my suggestions really landed, because you know, I couldn't really read the room. I'm not actually there. I can't sort of follow up with people individually and say, well, maybe yes, if you have a question about this, this is how I would interpret that point, or, you know, or allay any doubts or fears that sort of come up after that. And also it tends to be a lot more scheduled rather than improvised, right? I mean, if you're working in a team where you're all physically present in the same building or office, it's a 2-second pop over to somebody's desk. And whereas working in this way via these digital tools, one has to plan a period of time when you speak and, you know, have some kind of agenda for it. And so I think, yeah, there is a very real sense of adaptation to this new environment and how to be most effective using these tools and devices. And yeah, and also a certain sense of frustration or distance that you are inevitably going to have because you simply can't be present with people. And sometimes when they are going through very difficult moments, managing difficult situations, or, you know, really feeling like they need support, and you want to kind of evidence that support by being in a room with them or you know, chatting to them. So so I think that's something that we're all to some extent getting used to and dealing with. And I love that thing about shouting "I'm home" at the end, because if you do work from home, as I do a lot, there is this really important thing that you have to do to distinguish between what is your professional time and what is your own time. And, you know, it is very easy for the two to blur one into the other. And if you don't have another physical space that you can travel to or walk to or go to make that sort of psychological change, then I think you really do have to come up with some sort of inventive ways of marking that sort of distinction for yourself psychologically, because maintaining that barrier is important. And just as much as having the duty of care to members of your team and members of your group, you know, I think for a lot of leaders in this situation, there'll be a big feeling of frustration and sort of anxiety about, am I doing enough? How do I continue to do the things I was doing in this new situation? You know, how can I sort of not let people down? And I think that, and obviously just very practical worries about, oh my God, you know, I'm not getting any income from X, where am I going to replace that from? So I think all of that means that it's really central that arts leaders and senior and people who are, you know, in those positions in organizations feel supported, and they feel that not everything is on their shoulders all the time, and they feel the sense that in this extraordinary situation, you know, that there are sort of release valves and there are mechanisms of support. I think People Make It Work is you know, providing some really great free resources at this time, and other funders and people are doing the same. But you know, it's very important to sort of reiterate that point about self-care and making sure that, you know, that people are kind of thinking carefully about their own anxiety and their own, because apart from the professional uncertainty and difficulty, underlying all of this is, of course, a sort of anxiety that's affecting all of us about, you know, the disease. And I think that affects us in very subtle and sometimes invisible ways that we're not always aware of. And if we're not careful about that, you know, it can sort of develop into a real anxiety. So I think this point about trying to mark off your work, trying to, you know, give yourself space and time to adapt to new tools and new ways of working and understand, you know, how to get the best out of them is all really, really crucial. And just going back to something that I was saying earlier about this communication with audiences, I think there's an opportunity here to sort of establish a slightly different tone in our the relationship with audiences, which is to be very sort of open in a way, and to be saying, you know, because we are all in this sort of similar situation, and I think organizations aspire to have a very close, open connection with their audiences. But here is an opportunity, in a way, to acknowledge that closeness and to say, you know, we are going to take some time to be thinking through how we adapt to this situation, because that's what it requires. Bear with us, or, you know, we are working to bring you things further down the line, and we are still wanting to very much maintain our contact and our connection. But I think I think it's very important to sort of maintain a thread and a feeling among audiences and among the community, and that, you know, you're still very much going on and thinking through this situation as it evolves.
Definitely. And could you say a bit more about, was it anti-fragility that you were talking about?
Yeah, so anti-fragility, I mean, to be honest, I'm not always a huge Taleb fan, but he's this statistician and thinker who wrote a book a couple of years ago after the financial crisis called Anti-Fragility, and he'd been looking at, in nature, there are quite a lot of organisms which not only are adaptable to change, but actually seem to thrive when they are confronted by very difficult or critical situations. And so he coined this idea of anti-fragility, which is trying to develop a structure or a way of working or a way of being that actually responds positively to quite dramatic changes, even though they might appear to be, you know, very threatening. And so I think, just in practical terms, what does that mean when we're sort of talking about this kind of concept like anti-fragility? Well, again, I think some of the sort of points that Jeanie was mentioning earlier about learning, sort of having a pilot, creating, you know, a cross organizational team focused on a specific project, and allowing them to feed back iteratively to you, to the team, then allows your organization to learn more effectively. And so that might be one example of a way in which a change that's kind of forced on you by a difficult situation like this, or which you come up with as an adaptation to this situation, if you continue it or if you develop it in the long term, actually brings greater benefits, because you are then in a situation where, you know, you can bring in that learning on a recurring basis and feed it back into your work. So I mean, that's really the kind of concept behind anti-fragility. It's trying to set things up in a way that, you know, when another shock or another problem arises, not only does it not sort of cut you off at the knees, as it were, but it provides you with opportunities or materials because of the way you've put measures in place, like having a way of bringing in new experience or new learning into your organization. And I think that's a really that's one of the opportunities that I think this kind of situation presents, even though it may feel very difficult at the moment.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, that if you think about, I don't know, a cultural organisation that's really close to its audience, that's in dialogue with it and gives it agency, that feels like a sort of anti-fragile approach, because immediately that something happens, you're getting new data from your audience, because
absolutely, yeah,
and that'll generate a creative response that's like speaks to the experience and speaks to or hears the experience from that community and audience. So I really like that idea of thinking about ways that we can engineer ourselves to be kind of automatically positively responsive, because it is, of course, lots of the responses most recently have been about shutting down, closing down, cash flow protection. It's a really important thing to do. But you know, if we had an emergency fund that was always there and that was absolutely to be deployed at that moment, then that's the kind of thing, isn't it, where suddenly you'd be in that place of like, brilliant, we've got, you know, these are the criteria. I always think that in the US, when they declare an emergency, it's a really good result, because people get resources and they're like, declare, you know, make sure somebody declares an emergency. And that's because they've got the infrastructure to respond in a really agile way. And if you don't declare the emergency, you don't get the response. And if you do, you know, suddenly all these things happen. So I wonder if there's something like that that some of us might want to think about that is inspired by that idea that you're articulating, Charles, that, you know.
I think, you know, Vanessa was talking about this, and we talked a little bit earlier about the role of funders in relation to this. And, you know, how do you build resilience and adaptability over the longer term? Mm-hmm. Is it just a question of responding to situations like this and allowing people to continue? Well, of course, to some extent it is, but to some extent you want to build into that the opportunity, or as a funder, you would want to take the opportunity where available to help people to think about, you know, how to, as you say, structure things or engineer things so that in the future, if this kind of challenge recurs, or if another type of challenge, you know, they're better placed to deal with it. So I think there's some thinking, you know, I'm sure various funders are doing this, but, you know, I think there has to be some thinking as well about having an emergency fund, but an emergency fund which embeds principles of, you know, building longer term adaptability and survivability mm-hmm. in the way that it's rolled out.
Mm-hmm. Vanessa, where would you like, what have you heard across these conversations, and where would you like to finish our panel today? Have you some?
I'd like to just follow on from where Charles left off, because yes, I think that funders are going through a change of thinking as we speak, even if they're not, well, many of them are adapting their giving to emergency at the moment. But I think that the key for them is what is key for everybody else at the moment, that we're all in this together. There's no them and us in the way that perhaps there was with how occasionally we would have viewed audiences and the organisation. It's now one and the same thing. We're all in this together. And that applies to funders. And I think that this will not only affect how we move strategic thinking along, how we package what we want to have funded, because we believe that it's the appropriate thing in a given context, and we will go to funders with those. I think they will be really receptive. As I've said before, I can't encourage you enough. It's not that I've been briefed to say this, but I do genuinely think there will be a need on the part of the funders to understand what's going on now and how they can help. So there's a role there. And I think that in terms of communication strategies with stakeholders and of all sorts, I think that to build into the communication strategy that notion of we're all in this together. I think in framing what it is that you're saying you're doing and what you want to do, where you're going, but also to talk about what hasn't worked and why. Because I think that now, where at this present time, I think the world, I think human beings are interested to know actually what isn't working, what needs to be done about it, and what someone's thinking would be a better way forward. So let's actually rise to the occasion and actually be much more open. I think that, and there was another Jeanie and Charles talking about digital working, and I haven't sort of, it's a bit half-baked in my mind, but it's sort of to do with culture. It's to do with team members feeling that they can challenge. Mm. I'm just imagining that where we are at the moment, it could easily develop into a linear process of this is where we are, this is what we've got to do, step one, then step two, then step three, and so on. Fine, but it might be that, especially especially with remote working, individuals might feel, well, hold on a minute, what if I feel that something isn't working or there's another way of doing it? So I think in terms of continuing with culture, as would have been, as would have played out in a building or in a situation, it's not to forget that, and it's to seek it. As the leaders, to seek the challenge. That's all I would say. I'm going to end there because I'm a rebel and I like rebels.
Alan, thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today. It's been super helpful and just so important that we spend some time thinking. I think we have one luxury, which is that we sit outside of organisations sometimes, and I think that means we can make sense of some things that when you're immersed, it's hard to do. And I think we can bring some perspectives and experience that might help to sort of shine a light on or create a shortcut or a hack through some things that are happening right now. I feel like you three have certainly done that this afternoon. So thank you ever so much to Jeanie Scott, to you, Vanessa, Swann, and to Charles Beckett for joining us. And thank you for the time that you've committed as viewers to this conversation too. I hope you found it fruitful. There's more resources at changecreation.org and peoplemakeitwork.com. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye.
Thank you, Richard. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you.